I slipped the manila envelope through to the mail slot of the Victorian mansion, my heart hammering against my ribs as I heard it land with a soft thud on the marble foyer. Inside were 47 photographs, each one more damning than the last. My sister Maya wrapped around her brother-in-law like poison ivy, her wedding ring glinting in hotel room lighting while her husband worked 16-hour shifts to pay for her luxury shopping addiction. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one mailing evidence of her affair to his family. After all, in my previous life, I'd been the one caught in an affair that had never actually happened. I walked away from the Blackwood family estate, my breath misting in the November air, knowing that by tomorrow morning, Maya's perfect little world would begin to crumble. And this time, I wouldn't be the one paying for her sins. You see, I've lived this life before, 26 years of it to be exact. And I died believing I was the villain of my own story. The first time around, I'd been found dead in that exact same hotel room where Maya now conducted her real affair. Overdosed on pills that had never been mine, surrounded by staged photographs that painted me as a cheating, drug-addicted disgrace. The papers had called it suicide, shame finally catching up with the troubled younger daughter of the Mitchell family. Maya had cried such beautiful tears at my funeral, but death has a way of clarifying things. When I opened my eyes in my childhood bedroom on my 16th birthday, feeling phantom pain where Maya had injected something into my arm 6 months ago in that hotel room, I finally understood the scope of her 10-year campaign to destroy me. See, Maya wasn't just my beloved older sister. She was my mother's golden child, my father's princess, and the crown jewel of our family's social standing. Everything I'd ever wanted to be, she was effortlessly. Everything I'd ever tried to achieve, she'd already surpassed. And for reasons I'd never understood the first time around, she'd made it her life's mission to ensure I never rose above the role of her inferior shadow. The thing about living your life twice is that you start to notice patterns, details, the way Maya's eyes would glitter whenever I failed at something, how she always seemed to be nearby when disaster struck, the innocent mistakes that weren't mistakes at all. This time, I was paying attention. The timeline of my destruction had been methodical, I now realized. It started when I was 16 and Maya was 18, fresh off her acceptance to Harvard and engagement to David Blackwood, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. I'd been excited to start my junior year, confident in my grades and hopeful about my own college prospects. That's when the first accident happened. I'd been working on my early admission essay for Princeton when my laptop crashed, corrupting the file beyond recovery. Maya had been so sympathetic, offering to let me use her computer to rewrite it. What I hadn't known then was that she'd installed a keylogger, recording everything I typed. 2 days before the deadline, my essay appeared on an obscure academic forum posted by an anonymous account, making it impossible for me to submit it anywhere without being flagged for plagiarism. "Oh, honey," Maya had said, when I'd sobbed in her arms about my ruined chances. "Maybe Princeton just isn't meant for you. Have you considered community college? Not everyone is cut out for the Ivy Leagues." Mother had nodded along sympathetically. "Maya's right, sweetheart. Perhaps we should lower our expectations." The pattern repeated itself across every important moment of my life. When I'd started dating Jake Morrison, the sweet boy from my AP chemistry class, Maya had befriended his ex-girlfriend and fed her lies about me stealing her boyfriend. The drama that followed made me look petty and vindictive. Jake broke up with me, confused and hurt by my alleged behavior. When I'd gotten a summer internship at a prestigious marketing firm through my own merits, Maya had mentioned to the manager at a family barbecue that I'd been struggling with personal issues and might not be reliable. She'd seemed so concerned, so loving. I'd been let go after 2 weeks for attitude problems I'd never displayed. When I'd saved up enough money from part-time jobs to buy a car, Maya had helpfully offered to take me car shopping. She'd steered me toward a dealer friend of David's who'd sold me a vehicle with hidden problems. Within 6 months, I'd spent twice the car's value on repairs before it finally died completely, leaving me broke and transportation dependent on my family's charity. Each time, Maya was there with a hug and a reasonable explanation. Bad luck, poor judgment, naivety. She never gloated, that would have been too obvious. Instead, she positioned herself as my protector, the wise sister helping me navigate a world that seemed determined to knock me down. Our parents bought it completely. Maya was mature, responsible, successful. I was clearly the troubled child who needed guidance. Every setback reinforced their belief that I was fundamentally flawed while Maya was fundamentally superior. The financial abuse had been perhaps the most insidious. When Grandmother Mitchell died when I was 20, she'd left each granddaughter a trust fund of $200,000. Maya helped me set up the account, generously offering to introduce me to her financial advisor. What I didn't know was that she'd forged my signature on documents that gave her access to the account. Over 3 years, she'd systematically drained it through a series of loans I'd never agreed to and investments that somehow always failed. When I'd finally tried to access the money to pay for my last semester of college, I'd discovered it was gone. Maya had been shocked to learn that her financial advisor had apparently mismanaged my funds. She'd been so apologetic, so upset on my behalf. She'd even offered to help me pay for school, though, of course, I couldn't accept such a large favor from her. That would have been inappropriate. I'd dropped out with 3 months left in my senior year, crushed under student debt I'd never needed to acquire if I'd had access to my inheritance. But the cruelest blow had been my relationship with Marcus Chen. I'd met him at 24 when I was working 2 jobs and slowly rebuilding my life. He was kind, ambitious, and he saw something in me that my family never had. For 18 months, I'd believed I might finally have found happiness, despite everything Maya had done to sabotage me. Maya had other plans. She'd seduced Marcus with the same calculated precision she'd applied to every other demolition project in my life. Not with overt sexuality, that would have been crude. Instead, she'd positioned herself as the more successful, more sophisticated version of me. She'd invited him to family dinners where she'd casually mention her Harvard MBA, her promotion at David's pharmaceutical company, her perfect marriage. She'd include me in these invitations, of course, because she was such a caring sister. Sitting at those dinners, watching Marcus's eyes light up when Maya spoke about her achievements, while glazing over when I talked about my work at the nonprofit, I'd felt something inside me break. Maya would catch my eye across the table and smile with such warmth, such apparent innocence that I'd questioned my own growing suspicions. The affair had lasted 6 months. I'd discovered it accidentally walking into Marcus's apartment with my spare key to surprise him with dinner. Instead, I'd found him and Maya tangled together on his couch, her designer dress pooled on the floor next to his discarded shirt. "Sarah," Maya had said, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound shocked rather than guilty. "This isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. And as I'd stood there staring at the two most important people in my life, I'd realized that Maya's expression held no surprise at all. She'd been waiting for this moment. She'd orchestrated it. The breakup with Marcus had been brutal. Maya had convinced him that I was emotionally unstable, jealous of her success, and prone to dramatic accusations. When I'd tried to expose their affair to our parents, Maya had played the victim masterfully. She'd wept about how my mental health issues were escalating, how she was worried about my tendency toward paranoid delusions. She'd shown them text messages I'd sent to Marcus after discovering them together, texts that, stripped of context, made me look unhinged and obsessive. Our parents had been horrified. Not by Maya's betrayal, but by my apparent deterioration. They'd suggested therapy, medication, perhaps some time away to get myself together. Maya had supported these suggestions with such loving concern. The final blow had come 6 months later. Maya had convinced Marcus to marry her, a whirlwind romance that our parents had celebrated as true love conquering all obstacles. At their engagement party, I'd watched David, Maya's husband, congratulate Marcus with genuine warmth, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had been sleeping with her sister's boyfriend for half a year. That's when I'd started drinking. Not heavily at first, just enough to dull the edges of a reality that felt too sharp to bear. Maya had noticed, of course. She'd staged an intervention, complete with our parents and David, expressing concern about my downward spiral. She'd suggested I move in with her and David temporarily just until I got back on my feet. I'd refused, but Maya had persisted with that relentless, suffocating kindness that had defined our entire relationship. When I'd finally agreed, exhausted by her campaign of concern, I'd moved into their guest house feeling like a charity case. That's where Maya had found me 3 weeks later, unconscious and surrounded by the evidence of an affair I'd never had with a man I'd never met. The needle marks in my arm, the drugs I'd never taken, the photographs that painted me as a cheating, suicidal wreck. I died believing I was exactly what Maya had spent 10 years proving I was, worthless. But death had given me clarity. And now, with 16 years of life ahead of me and the knowledge of exactly how Maya operated, I had something she'd never expected me to possess: the power to see her coming. This time, I wasn't going to be her victim. The morning after my rebirth, I'd woken up in my teenage bedroom with a plan already forming. If Maya was going to systematically destroy my life again, she was going to have to work for it. And this time, I'd be working twice as hard to destroy hers. The first step was understanding my advantages. I had knowledge of 10 years' worth of Maya's schemes, her methods, her weaknesses. I knew which investments would fail, which relationships were doomed, which lies she'd tell and when. But more importantly, I knew something that could end her current perfect life before it even began. David wasn't the faithful husband he appeared to be. In my previous life, I'd never paid attention to the details of Maya's marriage. I'd been too focused on my own disasters to notice that David had been conducting his own affairs throughout their relationship. But now, armed with the cynicism that death brings, I'd started watching him differently during family dinners. The signs were obvious once you knew to look for them. The way he checked his phone constantly, his sudden business trips that Maya would mention with slight frustration, the lipstick stain on his collar that she'd never seemed to notice, the receipts for jewelry purchases that Maya never wore. By Christmas of my rebirth year, I'd confirmed what I'd suspected. David was seeing his secretary, Amanda Rodriguez, in the same hotel where Maya would eventually conduct her affair with Marcus. The same hotel where I'd died, poetry in motion. But I couldn't simply expose David's affair without proof. And I couldn't get proof without resources. So I'd started building those resources in ways Maya would never suspect. First, I'd approached Grandmother Mitchell differently. In my previous life, I'd been shy and awkward around her, intimidated by her sharp wit and disappointed by her obvious preference for Maya. This time, I'd studied her interests: antique collecting, art history, and a particular fascination with family genealogy. I'd spent hours researching our family history, memorizing details about ancestors she'd only mentioned in passing. "Sarah," she'd said during Christmas dinner, her eyebrows raised in surprise when I'd correctly identified the provenance of her newest acquisition, a Victorian mourning ring. "How did you know that?" "I've been researching our family history," I'd said, meeting her sharp gaze directly. "Did you know that great-great-grandmother Lucinda was actually a war profiteer during the Civil War? She made a fortune selling medical supplies to both armies." Maya had tried to interject with some vapid comment about how morbid historical research was, but Grandmother Mitchell had held up a hand to silence her. For the next hour, I'd regaled her with stories about our scandalous ancestors, their business ventures, their political machinations. I'd watched her eyes light up with each revelation. "You have a mind like mine," she'd told me as the evening wound down. "Sharp and unforgiving. I like that." By February, I'd become her favorite granddaughter. By May, she'd changed her will, leaving me not just the trust fund I'd lost in my previous life, but also a significant portion of her stock portfolio and her Connecticut estate. Maya had noticed the shift in grandmother's attention, but hadn't been concerned. After all, I was still the family disappointment, right? What could possibly have changed? With grandmother's backing and a growing nest egg from strategic investments, based on my knowledge of the next 10 years, I'd hired a private investigator to document David's affair. But I'd been specific in my instructions. I didn't want proof of the affair itself. I wanted proof of the money. Because David wasn't just cheating on Maya, he was embezzling from his own company to fund his lifestyle with Amanda. Company funds were paying for their hotel rooms, their weekend getaways, her jewelry. The affair was a sideshow. The real crime was the theft. Armed with this information, I'd made my next move. I'd gotten a job at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. Not through Maya's connections. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I'd used my Rebirth knowledge to ace an interview for a position in their accounting department, having memorized the specific qualifications that they'd be looking for based on changes they'd implement the following year. I'd presented myself as a detail-oriented community college graduate, humble, hardworking, grateful for the opportunity. Maya had been puzzled but supportive when I'd told her about the job. "It's wonderful that David's company has an opening perfect for your skill level," she'd said, with that particular smile that looked loving to everyone else but felt like a blade between my ribs. For 8 months, I'd worked diligently in accounting, building a reputation as a trustworthy employee while secretly gathering evidence of David's embezzlement. I documented every fraudulent expense report, every diverted payment, every fake vendor invoice. But I'd been careful never to let my investigation lead back to me. Instead, I'd fed anonymous tips to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, creating a paper trail that pointed toward a concerned whistleblower who'd never be identified. The investigation had been launched in March. By June, federal agents were quietly examining Blackwood Pharmaceuticals' books. By August, they'd discovered the full scope of David's theft, over $2 million diverted over 3 years. But I hadn't been satisfied with just destroying David. Maya had to pay for what she'd done to me, and she had to pay in the exact currency of humiliation and betrayal that she'd used against me. That's where Marcus came in. In my previous life, I'd met Marcus when I was 24 and desperate. This time, I'd orchestrated our meeting when I was 22 and planning. I'd known exactly where he'd be, exactly when, and exactly what to say to intrigue him. But instead of falling for him myself, I'd presented him with something much more interesting. My beautiful, successful married sister, who was clearly trapped in a loveless marriage with a cold pharmaceutical heir, I'd played Cupid with surgical precision. Casual mentions of Maya's loneliness during family dinners Marcus attended. Stories about how David never appreciated her artistic sensibilities. Opportunities for Maya and Marcus to spend time together without David around. I'd even suggested Marcus as a photography model for Maya's amateur photography hobby. A hobby I'd encouraged her to develop by gifting her an expensive camera for her birthday. Maya had taken the bait beautifully. Within 3 months, she was sneaking around with Marcus, convinced she was conducting a secret affair that no one suspected. She'd grown sloppy in her happiness, careless in her confidence. And I'd been there to document every moment of it. The photographs I'd just mailed to the Blackwood family weren't just evidence of infidelity. They were evidence of my sister's affair with the man she destroyed me over in my previous life, conducted while her husband stole money from his own family's company. Tomorrow morning, Victoria Blackwood would open that envelope and discover that her son was a thief and her daughter-in-law was an adulteress. The family board meeting scheduled for next week would become a tribunal. The Blackwood family's disgrace would be front-page news by Friday, and I would be miles away from the explosion, working at my new job at a rival pharmaceutical company that had just offered me a position in their executive training program. Grandmother Mitchell's letter of recommendation had been extraordinarily persuasive. The beautiful part was that Maya would never know I'd orchestrated any of it. To her, I was still the same struggling younger sister who worked in accounting and lived in a studio apartment. She had no idea that I'd spent the last 6 years building an empire in the shadows while she'd been busy conducting her affair. But the photographs were just the beginning. I had 10 years' worth of Maya's crimes to repay, and I intended to collect on every single one. I'd known this moment would come eventually. The confrontation. Maya wasn't stupid, just arrogant. Once the initial chaos died down and she'd had time to think, she'd start looking for someone to blame. And I was the obvious suspect, the bitter sister who'd always been jealous of her success. She arrived at my apartment 3 days after the photographs were delivered, her perfect composure finally cracked. Her marriage was over, the divorce proceedings were front-page news in the society section, and David was facing federal charges. The Blackwood family had not only disowned her, but were publicly discussing suing her for emotional distress and reputation damage. "You did this," she said without preamble when I opened the door. Her usual magazine perfect appearance was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, her makeup smudged. "I don't know how, but you did this." I led her into my apartment, my modest, carefully curated apartment that suggested a woman still struggling to make ends meet. Nothing about the space hinted at the growing portfolio of investments that grandmother's seed money had enabled, or the multiple job offers I'd been strategically collecting. "Did what?" I asked, settling into my secondhand armchair like someone who had nothing to hide. "Maya, you look terrible. What happened?" "Don't!" Her voice was sharp now, the mask of sisterly concern finally slipping. "Don't pretend you don't know. Someone sent photographs of Marcus and me to the Blackwood family. Professional quality photographs taken over months. This wasn't some coincidence or random exposure. Someone planned this." I tilted my head, studying her with the kind of detached curiosity I'd never been brave enough to display in my previous life. "And you think I somehow orchestrated an elaborate photography surveillance operation?" "Maya, I work in accounting. I can barely afford this apartment. What possible resources would I have to—" "You've always hated me," she interrupted. And there it was. The truth she'd spent 26 years hiding behind loving sister performances. "You've been jealous of everything I've achieved, everything I have. You couldn't stand that I was successful and happy while I what?" I asked softly. "While I struggled? While I failed at everything I tried? While I ended up broke and alone and working dead-end jobs?" She stopped, perhaps recognizing the dangerous edge in my voice. "Maya," I continued, standing slowly, "let me ask you something. Do you remember my Princeton essay? The one that got corrupted when my laptop crashed?" She frowned, confused by the non sequitur. "That was years ago. Why would I—" "It was never corrupted, was it? You posted it on that academic forum to make it impossible for me to submit it anywhere. Just like you told Jake Morrison's ex-girlfriend that I'd stolen her boyfriend when I'd never even spoken to her. Just like you convinced David's dealer friend to sell me a car you knew was falling apart. Just like you emptied my trust fund through your financial advisor, who somehow only made bad investments with my money while Maya Blackwood's portfolio flourished." With each accusation, Maya's face grew paler. But it wasn't guilt in her expression, it was fury at being caught. "You can't prove any of that," she said finally. "Can't I?" I walked to my kitchen counter and picked up a manila folder I'd left there specifically for this moment. Inside were bank records, email screenshots, witness statements, recorded phone calls, 10 years worth of evidence that I'd spent 6 years meticulously gathering. I've had a lot of time to think about patterns, Maya. Amazing how clearly things come into focus when you know what to look for. She lunged for the folder, but I'd anticipated that. I'd already mailed copies to multiple attorneys, along with detailed instructions for distribution should anything happen to me. "The thing is," I said, watching her face cycle through rage, fear, and calculation, "I don't actually want to use this, not yet. You see, Maya, I've learned something important about revenge. It's not about the destruction, it's about the justice. And you haven't suffered nearly enough to balance the scales." "What do you want?" she asked. And for the first time in my 2 lifetimes, I heard real fear in her voice. "I want you to understand what you took from me," I said. "In your previous life, in your life so far, you've stolen my education, my relationships, my financial security, my reputation, and my trust in my own perceptions. You convinced our entire family that I was fundamentally defective, while you systematically sabotaged every opportunity I had to prove otherwise." Maya's eyes were wide now, fixed on my face like she was seeing me for the first time. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to experience exactly what you put me through. The public humiliation, the financial ruin, the loss of everything you built your identity on. But unlike what you did to me, I'm going to let you know it's happening. I'm going to let you see every move before I make it, and you're going to be powerless to stop it because you'll never know exactly when or how I'll strike next." "Sarah," she said, her voice smaller now, "I'm your sister. We can work this out. I never meant for things to go as far as, you meant every bit of it. I cut her off. The only thing you didn't mean was getting caught. But here's the beautiful part, Maya. You're not actually caught yet. The photographs, David's embezzlement, Marcus's affair with you, that's all public knowledge now. But the systematic campaign you've waged against me for the past 10 years, that's still our secret. I moved closer, enjoying the way she instinctively stepped backward. As long as you play by my rules, it stays our secret. But if you try to interfere with my life again, if you breathe a word to our parents about this conversation, if you even look at me wrong at family dinner, I will bury you so completely that you'll wish you'd died in that hotel room instead of me. The last part slipped out before I could stop it, and Maya's face went white. Instead of you? She repeated. Sarah, what are you talking about? You never, huh? Didn't I? I smiled, and it felt like showing teeth. Good night, Maya. I'm sure you have a lot to figure out about your new life. I suggest you start with finding somewhere to live, since David's family owns your current home and they're highly motivated to see you gone. I closed the door in her face and listened to her footsteps disappear down the hallway. Phase 1 was complete. Now the real fun could begin. Maya's downfall accelerated with the kind of momentum that comes from years of careful preparation meeting perfect timing. Within a week of the photograph's delivery, the dominoes I'd spent years positioning began to fall in rapid succession. David's arrest made national news. The charges included embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud shareholders. The amounts involved had grown larger than I'd initially calculated. My investigation had uncovered irregularities that federal auditors missed, leading to the discovery of a wider scheme involving several company executives. David hadn't just been stealing to fund his affair. He'd been part of a systematic looting operation. Maya found herself not just divorced from a disgraced pharmaceutical heir, but also named as a defendant in the civil suits filed by Blackwood Pharmaceuticals shareholders. The lawyers argued that, as David's wife, she'd benefited from the stolen funds and should be liable for restitution. Her luxury wardrobe, her car, her jewelry, all of it was being scrutinized as potential evidence of ill-gotten gains. The beautiful irony was that Maya had always been scrupulously honest in her own financial dealings. She'd never knowingly spent stolen money. But the lifestyle David's legitimate salary had provided, combined with the circumstantial evidence of her affair with Marcus, which suggested she might have been conspiring with David to hide assets, created a compelling case for her involvement. I watched the proceedings from my new corner office at Titan Pharmaceuticals, where I'd been promoted to financial analyst after my tip to the FBI about Blackwood's irregularities had proven instrumental in their investigation. My superiors were impressed by my intuitive understanding of corporate financial structures and my natural investigative instincts. If they only knew, Maya tried to weather the storm with the same calculated grace she'd always employed, but she was playing a game where all the rules had changed. Her society friends began distancing themselves as the scandal deepened. Her job at a prestigious marketing firm ended when clients started requesting different account managers. Even our parents, while publicly supportive, began asking uncomfortable questions about how much she'd known about David's activities. That's when I made my second move. Marcus Chen had always been weak-willed, susceptible to manipulation by stronger personalities. In my previous life, Maya had exploited this to turn him against me. Now, I was exploiting it to turn him against her. I'd approached him at a coffee shop near his advertising agency, the same coffee shop where Maya would meet him for their affair in my previous timeline. This time, though, I'd gotten there first. Marcus, I'd said, sliding into the seat across from him, I think we need to talk. He'd been surprised to see me, clearly uncomfortable given everything that had happened with Maya. In his timeline, I was still the troubled younger sister, whose jealousy had apparently driven her to expose her sister's marriage in the most vindictive way possible. Sarah, he'd said cautiously, look, about what happened with your sister, what happened with my sister, I'd interrupted, is that she seduced you specifically to hurt me, and you fell for it because you wanted to believe she actually found you interesting for yourself. His face had flushed. That's not... Maya and I connected because we have similar... Marcus. I'd placed a photograph on the table between us. Not one of the affair photos I'd sent to the Blackwoods, but something much more damaging. A screenshot of text messages between Maya and her friend Jennifer from my previous life. Messages I'd seen on her phone years ago when she'd left it unlocked during a family barbecue. The messages were from a conversation about Marcus that had taken place 2 weeks before they'd officially met. Maya discussing him as a perfect target for making me suffer, analyzing his psychological profile, planning exactly how to approach him. She'd even included a crude assessment of his sexual preferences based on his dating history. Marcus had read the messages twice, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and finally rage. "How did you get these?" he'd asked. "I have been documenting Maya's behavior for years," I'd said, which was technically true. I knew she'd eventually go too far, and I wanted to be ready when she did. The affair with you wasn't about love, Marcus. It was about destroying me. You were just the weapon she chose to use. I'd leaned forward, my voice gentle despite the brutality of what I was revealing. She never loved you. She doesn't even find you particularly attractive. Check her phone sometime. She has a running group chat with her friends where she calls you Sarah's puppy and makes jokes about how easy you are to manipulate. That last part had been a lie, but a plausible one. Maya was exactly the kind of person who would humiliate her affair partner behind his back, and Marcus knew it. "What do you want from me?" he'd asked finally. "I want you to understand that you're a victim here too," I'd said. "Maya targeted you specifically because she knew it would hurt me the most. She studied you, Marcus. She learned your interests, your insecurities, your dreams, and she used all of it against you. The woman you think you're in love with is a carefully constructed persona designed to make you betray someone who actually cared about you." It had taken 3 more meetings, but eventually Marcus had agreed to help me. Not out of love for me. That ship had sailed in my previous life. But out of rage at being used so completely. Maya had underestimated the intensity of his pride, his hatred of being made a fool. His role was simple: stay close to Maya during her crisis, gain her trust as her only remaining ally, and document everything she said about her plans to rebuild her life. I needed to know her next move so I could stay 3 steps ahead. What Marcus discovered exceeded even my expectations. Maya wasn't planning to quietly rebuild her life. She was planning to destroy mine as revenge for what she believed I'd done to her. She'd convinced herself that I was somehow responsible for David's arrest, the photographs, and the collapse of her marriage. In her mind, I'd finally revealed my true nature as a vindictive, jealous sister who'd spent years plotting her downfall. She wasn't wrong, of course, but her reasoning was completely backwards. She thought she was finally seeing my vicious nature emerge from years of docile suffering. In reality, she was seeing the result of her own vicious nature being reflected back at her. Through Marcus, I learned that Maya was planning to frame me for David's embezzlement. She'd kept careful records of my employment at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, and she was working with a lawyer to build a case that I'd used my position in accounting to steal money and frame David. The affair photographs, she planned to argue, were part of my elaborate scheme to destroy both her and David out of jealousy. It was actually brilliant in its way. It used my own investigation against me and painted me as the mastermind of everything that had happened. If she could prove I'd had access to the financial records and demonstrate a motive for wanting to harm both her and David, she might actually succeed in shifting blame away from herself. There was just one problem with her plan. I'd been expecting it. The key to destroying Maya completely wasn't just anticipating her moves. It was understanding that her greatest weakness had always been her need to be admired. She couldn't just win. She needed everyone to acknowledge that she deserved to win. She couldn't just succeed. She needed recognition for her superiority. And she couldn't just survive a crisis. She needed to emerge as the hero of her own story. That compulsion would be her downfall. Marcus reported that Maya was planning to reveal her evidence of my supposed crimes at Thanksgiving dinner, in front of our entire extended family. She wanted the maximum audience for her vindication, the most dramatic possible reversal of her current disgrace. In her mind, proving that I was the real villain would restore her position as the wronged party deserving of sympathy and support. I let her make her preparations. Through Marcus, I fed her information that made her case seem stronger. Carefully crafted lies about my supposed resentment toward her success, my alleged drinking problem, my apparent mental instability. I wanted her completely confident in her narrative by the time she presented it. Meanwhile, I made preparations of my own. The week before Thanksgiving, I'd arranged for Grandmother Mitchell to receive an anonymous package. Inside was a complete dossier on Maya's 10-year campaign against me, documented with the kind of meticulous detail that only someone with my unique perspective could provide. Financial records showing the systematic theft of my trust fund. Email records proving Maya's role in sabotaging my job opportunities. Testimony from witnesses who'd observed Maya's manipulations but had never spoken up. But the crown jewel was a psychological evaluation I'd commissioned from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a renowned forensic psychiatrist who specialized in family abuse dynamics. I'd provided her with the complete timeline of Maya's behavior, stripped of identifying details and presented as a case study. Her assessment was clinical and damning. Maya exhibited textbook patterns of narcissistic personality disorder combined with antisocial traits. The systematic nature of her sabotage, her ability to maintain a loving facade while conducting psychological warfare, her complete lack of empathy for her victim, it all pointed to a personality disorder that made her fundamentally dangerous to those around her. Grandmother Mitchell had always prided herself on her ability to read people. When she'd finished reviewing the evidence I'd provided, she'd called me immediately. "How long have you known?" she'd asked without preamble. "Known what, Grandmother?" "Don't play coy, Sarah. This dossier is too detailed, too accurate, too complete to have been compiled by someone who wasn't intimately familiar with Maya's victim. You've been documenting this abuse for years." I'd taken a breath, letting a calculated amount of pain enter my voice. "I started keeping records after the trust fund disappeared. I thought maybe if I could prove what she was doing, someone would finally believe me. But every time I tried to show anyone, it just made me look paranoid and vindictive. Maya's too good at what she does." "Not anymore," Grandmother had said grimly. "I'm calling your parents tonight, and Maya's invited to lunch on Sunday to discuss her future." Sunday's lunch was everything I could have hoped for. Grandmother Mitchell had invited Maya to her estate, ostensibly to discuss financial support during her divorce proceedings. Maya had arrived expecting sympathy and assistance from the one family member wealthy enough to make her troubles disappear. Instead, she'd found herself facing a tribunal. I hadn't been present. Grandmother had been specific that this conversation needed to happen privately. But Maya's face, when she'd emerged from the estate 3 hours later, told me everything I needed to know. She'd walked to her car like someone in shock, moving with the mechanical precision of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Marcus had reported the details later. Grandmother Mitchell had presented Maya with the evidence piece by piece, building an unassailable case for years of systematic psychological and financial abuse. She demanded explanations for each incident, forcing Maya to either admit to deliberate sabotage or craft increasingly elaborate lies about coincidences and misunderstandings. The financial records had been impossible to explain away. Maya had tried to claim she genuinely thought she was helping me by managing my trust fund, but the paper trail showed deliberate deception at every step. Forged signatures, falsified investment reports, missing funds that had mysteriously appeared in accounts Maya controlled. But the psychological evaluation had been the killing blow. Grandmother had read selected passages aloud, each one describing Maya's behavior with clinical precision. The manipulation tactics, the gaslighting, the systematic destruction of my self-esteem and opportunities. All of it laid out in academic language that made Maya's actions sound like the calculated cruelty they'd always been. By the end of the meeting, Maya had been crying. Not the beautiful, sympathetic tears she'd cried at my funeral, but ugly, desperate sobs of someone who'd finally been exposed for what she really was. "You have two choices," Grandmother had told her. "You can quietly disappear from this family's life, relocate somewhere far away, and never contact Sarah again. In exchange, this evidence stays private. Or you can continue your campaign against her, in which case I will ensure that every detail of what you've done becomes public knowledge. I'll make sure every future employer, every potential relationship, every social circle you try to join knows exactly what kind of person you are, she'd continued. I have more money and influence than you can imagine, Maya, and I will use all of it to ensure that you spend the rest of your life facing the same kind of systematic sabotage you inflicted on your sister. Maya had agreed to the terms, of course. What choice did she have? But I'd known she wouldn't honor them. Maya's personality disorder wouldn't allow her to accept defeat so completely. She'd lay low for a while, regroup, and then strike back harder than ever. The exposure hadn't cured her, it had just taught her to be more careful. That's why Thanksgiving dinner was still going to be interesting. Maya arrived at Thanksgiving dinner looking like a woman who'd found her second wind. She'd spent the week since grandmother's ultimatum carefully crafting a new narrative, and she'd clearly decided that attacking was better than retreating. She'd dressed for the occasion in a simple but elegant black dress that suggested both mourning for her marriage and dignity in adversity. Her makeup was subtle, her hair pulled back in a style that looked professional and serious. Every detail was calculated to present her as a woman wronged but unbroken. The extended family had gathered as usual: our parents, Aunt Catherine, and Uncle Robert with their twin boys, cousin Jennifer and her husband, and grandmother Mitchell presiding over the chaos with her usual sharp-eyed authority. Everyone knew about Maya's divorce and David's legal troubles, but the details of how the affair had been exposed remained mysteriously vague. Maya waited until dessert to make her move. She'd been quiet through most of dinner, deflecting questions about her situation with gracious non-answers that suggested she was too dignified to discuss the painful details. It was a masterful performance of wounded nobility. "I need to share something with all of you," she'd said finally, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant determination. "I've discovered something about David's arrest and my divorce that I think you all deserve to know." The table had gone quiet. Maya had positioned herself perfectly, seated where everyone could see her face clearly, Grandmother Mitchell directly across from her. "I believe Sarah was responsible for both the photographs that destroyed my marriage and the financial evidence that led to David's arrest," she'd announced. The silence that followed was profound. I'd sat perfectly still, letting my face show exactly the right amount of shock and hurt. Not too much, that would look like overacting. Just enough to seem genuinely wounded by the accusation. "Maya," Mother had said finally, "that's a very serious accusation to make against your sister." "I know it is," Maya had replied, "but I have evidence." She'd pulled out a folder, a deliberate echo of the evidence I'd shown her in my apartment. Inside were documents that painted an apparently convincing case. My employment records at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, testimony from coworkers about my suspicious interest in David's expense reports, my supposed motive for wanting to hurt both her and David. It was actually impressive research. Maya had clearly spent the entire week building her counternarrative, finding legitimate evidence that could be interpreted in damning ways. The fact that I'd worked in Blackwood's accounting department did make me an obvious suspect for the financial crimes investigation. My access to company records, combined with my history of being jealous of Maya's success, created a plausible motive. She'd even found a witness who claimed to have seen me near the hotel where the affair photographs were taken. It was almost certainly a lie. I'd been careful about surveillance, but it was the kind of lie that was difficult to disprove. "Sarah has been systematically sabotaging my life for years," Maya had continued, warming to her theme. "I think she saw an opportunity when David's business started struggling, and she used her position at his company to frame him for embezzlement while simultaneously exposing my affair to destroy both of us at once." "This is ridiculous," I'd said, allowing my voice to shake slightly. "Maya, I would never—" "You've always resented me," she'd cut me off. "You've been jealous of my marriage, my career, my relationship with Mom and Dad. When you got that job at David's company, you finally found a way to hurt me." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Maya had built her case well, and she was presenting it with the kind of passionate conviction that made it sound believable. If I'd been anyone else, if I hadn't known exactly how Maya operated, I might have found myself questioning my own innocence. But I wasn't anyone else, and I'd been preparing for this exact moment. Maya, I'd said quietly, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. The stress of everything that's happened, the divorce, David's arrest, I think it's affecting your judgment. My judgment is fine, she'd snapped. I'm the only one who sees what you really are. That's when Grandmother Mitchell spoke. Actually, Maya, she'd said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, I think we all see quite clearly what's happening here. She'd stood, moving to the antique cabinet where she kept important documents. From it, she'd withdrawn a thick folder, the same folder I'd sent her the week before. Sarah provided me with some very interesting reading material recently, she'd continued. Documentation of a decade-long pattern of psychological and financial abuse that you've inflicted on her. Would you like me to share the details with everyone? Maya's face had gone ashen. Grandmother, I don't know what Sarah told you, but she didn't tell me anything, Grandmother had interrupted. She showed me bank records, financial documents, email correspondence, witness statements, a forensic psychological evaluation that describes your behavior in terms that I think everyone at this table would find illuminating. The folder had landed on the table with a heavy thud. Maya had stared at it like it was a bomb about to explode. For instance, Grandmother had continued, opening to a bookmarked page, there's this fascinating detail about Sarah's Princeton essay that was mysteriously posted online just before the submission deadline, making it impossible for her to apply anywhere without being accused of plagiarism. The IP address trace led back to your laptop, Maya. Or this documentation of the systematic theft of Sarah's trust fund through falsified investment reports and forged signatures. Your financial advisor has been very cooperative with investigators, by the way. Apparently, he kept detailed records of your instructions regarding which bad investments to make with Sarah's money, while your own portfolio consistently outperformed the market. Each revelation hit the table like a physical blow. Our parents' faces had gone through shock, confusion, and finally something approaching horror as the scope of Maya's deception became clear. The most interesting part, Grandmother had continued relentlessly, is this psychological profile prepared by Dr. Elizabeth Harper, one of the country's leading experts on family abuse dynamics. Her assessment suggests that Maya's behavior represents not just isolated incidents of sibling rivalry, but a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to destroy Sarah's sense of self-worth and ability to function independently. Maya had finally found her voice. This is all lies, she'd said, but her usual confidence was gone. Sarah's manipulating you the same way she manipulated the FBI into investigating David's embezzlement? Grandmother had asked sweetly. Because I have it on good authority that their investigation was triggered by an anonymous tip that provided evidence only someone with intimate knowledge of David's activities could have possessed. Evidence that Sarah, working in accounting, would have been uniquely positioned to discover and document. That's when I'd made my final move. Maya, I'd said, standing slowly, I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this. For years, I hoped that maybe someday you'd realize what you were doing to me and stop. I kept quiet about the trust fund theft because I thought maybe you'd taken the money for some good reason and would eventually explain. I never reported the academic sabotage because I thought maybe it really had been an accident. I'd looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member in turn. Even when you seduced Marcus specifically to hurt me, I tried to convince myself that maybe you actually cared about him. That maybe this was finally about your happiness instead of my misery. But you couldn't leave it at that, I'd continued. You couldn't just win. You needed me to suffer. You needed everyone to see me suffer and acknowledge that you were better than me. You needed to destroy me so completely that I'd never be able to threaten your position as the perfect daughter. Maya's mouth had opened and closed silently. For the first time in her life, she had no manipulation tactics that could work. The truth was too well documented, too clearly presented, and delivered by someone she could no longer gaslight. So yes, I'd finished, I exposed your affair. I provided evidence of David's embezzlement. I fed the FBI information that led to his arrest. And I documented every single thing you've done to me over the past 10 years so that when you inevitably tried to destroy me as revenge, I'd have proof of exactly what kind of person you really are. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then Aunt Catherine spoke. Jesus Christ, Maya, what is wrong with you? And just like that, the spell Maya had held over our family for 26 years was broken. Not through some dramatic revelation or tearful confession, but through the simple presentation of facts that could no longer be denied or explained away. Maya had tried to rally, of course. She'd claimed the evidence was fabricated, that I was the real manipulator, that everyone was being fooled by my victim act. But every word just dug her grave deeper. The more she protested her innocence, the more obvious her guilt became. By the end of the evening, Maya had been effectively disowned. Not formally, our parents weren't quite ready to take that step, but practically. She was no longer welcome at family gatherings until she got help for her issues. Her access to family resources was cut off immediately, and most devastatingly for someone of her psychological makeup, she was no longer the golden child whose opinion mattered above all others. I'd driven home that night feeling something I'd never experienced in either of my lives: complete and total victory. But Maya still had one more card to play. The attempted murder came exactly 11 months after my rebirth, right on schedule with Maya's pattern of escalation from my previous life. I'd been expecting it, planning for it, and I was ready. Maya had spent 2 months after Thanksgiving trying to rebuild her reputation through alternative channels. She'd moved to Boston, taken a position at a smaller marketing firm, and begun dating an investment banker named Richard who was unaware of her history. She'd seemed to be following grandmother's ultimatum, starting fresh somewhere new and leaving me alone. But that had never been Maya's real plan. She'd been establishing an alibi. The attack came on a Friday evening when I was leaving my office building. A man I didn't recognize approached me in the parking garage, claiming to be a private investigator working for David's defense team. He wanted to ask me a few questions about my time at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, he said. Just routine follow-up for their appeal. In my previous life, I would have trusted him. This time, I recognized him immediately. Tony Castellano, the same man Maya had hired to stage the hotel room scene that had led to my death. He'd aged 10 years, but his approach was identical. Professional demeanor, disarming smile, carefully practiced questions designed to separate me from potential witnesses. I'm sorry, I'd told him, backing toward my car. I've been advised by my attorney not to discuss the Blackwood case without legal representation present. This will just take a moment, he'd insisted, stepping closer. Nothing formal, just a quick clarification about... I'd activated the emergency alarm on my car keychain, filling the parking garage with shrieking noise. Tony had frozen, clearly not expecting that response to his rehearsed approach. Security will be here in 30 seconds, I'd told him. If you're actually a licensed investigator working for David's legal team, you can contact my attorney to schedule a formal interview. If you're not, I suggest you leave before building security arrives. He'd left, quickly. 20 minutes later, I'd been in Detective Maria Santos's office, filing a report about the attempted contact and providing her with Tony Castellano's photograph and license plate number. Detective Santos was an old friend, the same detective who'd investigated my suicide in my previous life, and had always harbored doubts about the official conclusion. You think this might be connected to your sister's situation? She'd asked after reviewing my statement. I think Maya is desperate, I'd said carefully. Her entire life has collapsed in the past year, and she blames me for all of it. I'm worried she might do something extreme. Extreme how? Yeah, I'm not sure, but Maya has always been intense when she doesn't get what she wants. And right now, she wants me to pay for what she thinks I've done to her. Detective Santos had taken the threat seriously, especially when I'd provided her with copies of the psychological evaluation that identified Maya as potentially dangerous. She'd agreed to place Maya under informal surveillance and to flag any further contact from private investigators or other unknown parties. 2 days later, the surveillance paid off. Maya had flown to New York on Sunday and checked into the same hotel where she'd framed me in my previous life. Tony Castellano had met her there Monday morning, By Monday evening, Detective Santos had enough evidence to arrest both of them for conspiracy to commit assault. The plan Maya had developed was elegant in its simplicity. She'd lured me to the hotel under false pretenses, a fake job interview with a pharmaceutical headhunter who'd claimed to be impressed by my work at Blackwood. Once I was there, Tony would have drugged me and staged a scene identical to my previous death. Apparent suicide by overdose, surrounded by evidence of an affair that painted me as unstable and guilt-ridden. The difference this time was that Maya had intended to be discovered mid-setup, playing the role of the concerned sister who'd arrived just too late to save me. She'd be the tragic figure who'd tried to help her troubled sibling but couldn't overcome my self-destructive tendencies. The attempted frame-up would have looked like my final vindictive act against her, and my death would have been seen as the inevitable conclusion of my jealous obsession, and it would have been perfect if I hadn't been expecting it. The recordings Detective Santos had made of Maya and Tony discussing the plan were damning beyond any possible defense. Maya's voice, clear and cold, detailing exactly how to position my body for maximum emotional impact. Tony's professional suggestions about which drugs would be least detectable and which staging elements would be most convincing. Make sure the photographs are scattered around her body, Maya had said in one particularly chilling segment. I want it to look like she was obsessing over my affair when she decided to end it all, the guilt and jealousy finally consuming her. And the suicide note? Tony had asked. I'll write it myself. Something about how sorry she is for trying to destroy my marriage, how she can't live with what she's done. Make it look like a confession and an apology. What about your alibi? I'll be in Boston at work, then I'll get a call from someone who's worried because Sarah missed an important meeting. I'll drive down immediately, find the door locked, and call the police when she doesn't answer. I'll be the concerned sister who tried to save her but was just too late. The plan was comprehensive, well-researched, and absolutely chilling in its premeditation. Maya hadn't just wanted me dead. She'd wanted my death to serve her narrative about being the wronged party in our relationship. When the arrests were made, Maya had been genuinely shocked. Not by the charges, she'd known exactly what she was doing, but by the fact that I'd anticipated her moves so completely. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she'd stared at me with something approaching respect. How? She'd asked. You taught me everything I needed to know, I'd replied. I just finally learned how to listen. The trial lasted 8 months and dominated local news throughout. Maya's case became a study in narcissistic manipulation and family abuse that legal experts cited as a textbook example of psychological warfare. The evidence was so comprehensive, the documentation so thorough, that Maya's defense team advised her to plead guilty rather than face a jury trial that would almost certainly result in a longer sentence. The attempted murder charge carried a sentence of 15 to 25 years. The financial crimes related to my trust fund added another 10. The psychological abuse couldn't be prosecuted criminally, but it provided crucial context for sentencing that painted Maya as a habitual predator who'd used familial relationships to mask years of systematic cruelty. Maya had tried to maintain her innocence initially, claiming she was the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by me. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the timeline too clear. Her own voice on police recordings discussing murder plans made any claims of victimhood laughable. In the end, she'd accepted a plea agreement. 20 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 15. Tony Castellano, who'd cooperated fully once he'd realized the scope of evidence against him, had received 10 years. I'd attended every day of the legal proceedings, sitting in the gallery where Maya could see me, watching her perfect mask finally slip completely. Without the ability to manipulate the narrative, she'd revealed herself as exactly what she was. A calculating predator who'd spent years masquerading as a loving sister. The family dynamics had shifted completely in the aftermath. Our parents, forced to confront the reality of what Maya had done, had begun attending therapy to process their own role in enabling her abuse. They had started asking questions about all the incidents they'd dismissed as my personal failings, viewing them now through the lens of systematic sabotage. We failed you, Mother had said during one particularly difficult conversation. We should have seen what was happening. We should have protected you. You believed the daughter who seemed more successful, I'd replied. Maya was very good at what she did. It took me years to understand it myself. Aunt Catherine had become my strongest advocate within the family, expressing anger not just at Maya, but at the adults who'd allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. That girl was a sociopath, she'd said bluntly during one family dinner. And we all just stood by and watched her torture Sarah because she was prettier and more charming. Cousin Jennifer had been horrified to learn how close she'd come to being Maya's next victim. In my previous life, Maya had begun targeting Jennifer's academic achievements just before my death, setting up similar patterns of sabotage. Jennifer's mother had intercepted this early and shut it down, but only because the exposure of Maya's true nature had made everyone hypersensitive to her manipulation tactics. Grandmother Mitchell had been characteristically direct in her assessment. Maya was a predator who used familial love as camouflage, she'd told me. The tragedy isn't that she was caught. The tragedy is that it took so long. But the most satisfying response had come from Marcus Chen. Marcus had testified for the prosecution during Maya's trial, providing detailed evidence about her manipulation tactics and her complete lack of genuine feeling for him. His testimony had been devastating, delivered with the cold anger of someone who'd finally understood how thoroughly he'd been used. She studied me like a lab rat, he'd told the court. She learned my interests, my insecurities, my relationship history, and she crafted a persona specifically designed to make me fall in love with her. Every conversation we had, every intimate moment, every declaration of feeling was calculated to serve her agenda of hurting her sister. The prosecutor had asked him to elaborate on Maya's statements about me during their relationship. She would tell me stories about Sarah's jealousy, her instability, her tendency toward vindictive behavior. At the time, I believed these were concerns from a loving sister. Now I realize they were preemptive character assassination designed to make me doubt anything Sarah might tell me about Maya's real nature. Marcus's testimony had provided crucial insight into Maya's psychological tactics. The jury had been visibly disturbed by his description of how coldly she'd discussed their relationship, how she'd laughed about his emotional attachment to her, how she'd planned to discard him once I'd been sufficiently devastated. After the trial, Marcus had approached me with something resembling an apology. "I need you to know that I never intended for things to go the way they did," he'd said. "I thought what Maya and I had was real. I believed her when she said you were unstable and jealous. I should have known better." "You couldn't have known better," I'd replied, and I'd meant it. Maya is exceptionally good at manipulation. She's had 26 years to perfect her techniques. "Still," he'd said, "I should have listened to you. I should have seen what was happening." "Marcus," I'd said gently, "Maya destroyed my life for 10 years, using the same tactics she used on you. The difference is that you got out after 6 months. Don't torture yourself over falling for something I couldn't escape for a decade." He'd nodded, but I could see the guilt he'd carry forever. Maya's final victim was always her accomplices, the people she convinced to participate in her cruelty. They'd have to live with what they'd helped her do, even after understanding that they'd been manipulated. In a way, that was the most perfect revenge of all. 5 years after Maya's conviction, I stood in my corner office at Titan Pharmaceuticals, reviewing the quarterly reports for the nonprofit foundation I'd established with my grandmother's inheritance. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Psychological Abuse Recovery had grown into one of the largest advocacy organizations in the country, providing legal support, counseling services, and financial assistance to victims of family abuse. The foundation's work had become my true calling. Using my experience and resources to help others escape situations similar to what I'd endured gave meaning to everything I'd suffered. The foundation had helped over 3,000 people in 5 years, providing them with the support and recognition they'd been denied by their families. Dr. Elizabeth Harper served on our board of directors, lending her expertise to develop new therapeutic approaches for abuse recovery. Detective Maria Santos headed our legal advocacy division, helping victims navigate law enforcement systems that were often unprepared to handle psychological abuse cases. Even Marcus Chen contributed to our work, using his advertising expertise to create public awareness campaigns about family manipulation and psychological warfare. We'd never rekindled our romantic relationship, Too much had happened for that, but we'd found a partnership in healing that felt more valuable than what we'd lost. The foundation had also become a research center for understanding and identifying family abuse dynamics. Maya's case had become a study model for psychology programs across the country, demonstrating how personality disorders could manifest in systematic campaigns of destruction against vulnerable family members. I'd published a book about my experience, carefully anonymized but detailed enough to help others recognize similar patterns in their own lives. The Golden Child Shadow, Understanding Family Narcissistic Abuse had become a bestseller, praised by professionals and readers alike for its clear analysis of manipulation tactics and recovery strategies. The speaking engagements that followed had taken me around the country, sharing my story with audiences who often included people trapped in situations similar to my original experience. After each presentation, people approached me with their own stories of golden child siblings, manipulative parents, and family members who used love as a weapon. "How did you know?" was the question I heard most often. "How did you know what she was doing when everyone else believed her?" I always gave the same answer. I stopped believing that love couldn't coexist with cruelty. Maya loved me in her way, but her love was possessive and destructive. She loved me the way a child loves a toy they don't want anyone else to play with, even if they break it in the process. Maya herself had been a model prisoner, according to the updates I received from the victim advocacy system. She'd participated in therapy programs, earned her GED, and reportedly showed genuine remorse for her actions. Her psychologist's report suggested significant progress in understanding the impact of her behavior. I'd never visited her, despite her requests. That level of closure felt unnecessary. My healing had come not from her apologies or acknowledgement, but from building a life that reflected my own values rather than reacting to her manipulations. Grandmother Mitchell had lived to see Maya's conviction and my foundation's launch before passing peacefully at 91. Her final gift had been the Connecticut estate, which I'd converted into a residential facility for abuse survivors who needed safe housing while rebuilding their lives. Our parents had eventually found their own form of peace, though it had taken years of therapy and a great deal of soul-searching about their role in enabling Maya's behavior. They'd become advocates themselves, working with other parents to recognize the signs of toxic sibling dynamics and intervene before permanent damage occurred. "We raised a predator," Dad had said during one particularly difficult family therapy session. "We rewarded her for behaviors that should have horrified us, and we punished Sarah for being victimized. I don't know how to forgive ourselves for that." "You forgive yourselves by doing better," I'd replied, "by helping other families avoid the same mistakes, by supporting survivors instead of their abusers." The work had been healing for all of us. Dad had joined the Foundation's board, focusing on financial advocacy for abuse victims. Mother had become a peer counselor, specializing in helping parents recognize and address toxic family dynamics. They'd never fully overcome their guilt about the years they'd spent believing Maya over me, but they'd channeled that guilt into meaningful action that helped others. In a way, their redemption arc had been as satisfying as Maya's downfall. Standing in my office now, looking out at the city skyline from the 42nd floor, I reflected on the strange gift that death had given me. Not just the knowledge to avoid Maya's traps, but the perspective to understand that my suffering had always had the potential to become strength. In my previous life, I died believing I was worthless, damaged, fundamentally flawed in ways that justified Maya's treatment of me. The rebirth had shown me that my perceived weaknesses, my empathy, my desire for harmony, my willingness to sacrifice for family, weren't character defects. They were strengths that Maya had exploited because she lacked them herself. Maya had spent 26 years trying to prove that she was superior to me by destroying everything I valued. What she'd never understood was that superiority built on someone else's destruction isn't real achievement. It's just cruelty disguised as success. I defeated her not by becoming cruel in return, but by becoming exactly what she'd always accused me of being: someone who refused to accept abuse, who fought for justice, who wouldn't be silenced or marginalized. The irony was perfect. Maya's greatest fear had been that I would eventually see my own worth and stop accepting her treatment of me. by trying to prevent that awakening. She'd guaranteed it. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harper. The Foundation's latest research study had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Family Psychology, adding to the growing body of academic work on sibling abuse dynamics. Our findings were being used to train therapists, social workers, and law enforcement officers to recognize and address family manipulation patterns. Maya's abuse had damaged thousands of people indirectly. The families who'd believed her narratives about me, the people who'd failed to help because they'd bought into her portrayal of herself as the victim, the systems that had failed to protect me because Maya had been so skilled at appearing reasonable. Now her abuse was helping thousands of people heal. The Foundation's work had prevented countless tragedies, identified hundreds of predators, and provided resources for survivors who'd previously had nowhere to turn. In trying to destroy me, Maya had inadvertently created something far more powerful than she'd ever imagined, a legacy of justice that would outlive both of us. I picked up the latest letter from our Boston office. A woman named Catherine had written to thank the Foundation for helping her escape a situation with her narcissistic brother that mirrored my experience with Maya almost exactly. Her letter included a photo of her college graduation, the achievement her brother had tried to sabotage but that she'd accomplished with the Foundation's support. "Because of your work," she'd written, "I finally understand that the problem was never me. I'm not weak or stupid or jealous. I was just targeted by someone who needed me to believe I was those things in order to feel superior herself." I smiled, filing the letter in the drawer with hundreds of others like it. Maya might have broken me once, but in doing so, she'd taught me exactly how to help others avoid the same fate. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the city where I'd once thought I'd die unknown and unmourned. Now I lived here as someone who'd transformed personal trauma into public service, private pain into social change. Maya had 15 more years to serve on her sentence. When she was released, she'd emerge into a world that understood personality disorders and family abuse in ways that hadn't existed when she'd been at the height of her power. The techniques that had made her so successful as a predator were now cataloged, studied, and widely recognized. She would find no new victims waiting for her. No one else would fall for the loving sister act, the concerned family member routine, and the helpful older sibling persona she'd perfected over decades of practice. Maya would be released into a world that had learned to see her coming. And I would be there, not as her victim or her victim, but as the architect of the systems that would contain her. The foundation I'd built, the awareness I'd spread, the legal precedents my case had established, they would all be waiting for her. Maya had taught me that love could be weaponized, that family could be a hunting ground, that kindness could mask cruelty. I'd learned those lessons well, and then I'd use them to build something better. Justice, it turns out, is just revenge that serves a higher purpose. And my purpose had become larger than Maya could have ever imagined.